Our first presentation is from Professor Sjöholm from Lund in Sweden. He's a professor in international economics at the Department of Economics at Lund University. He's external fellow at the Leverhulme Center for Research on Globalization and Economic Policy, and a member of the Asian Economic Panel, as well as of the Council of Fellows of the East Asian Economic Association. So you already get an idea about the internationality involved in his work, and the title of his presentation is The Economic Impact of Globalization. Very glad to have you here. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter, and let me start by thanking the organizing committee here for inviting me to this fantastic event. And also on the behalf of Lund University, I must thank you for being so kind and having students from our university at the summer school here that arranged by the academy. It's very much appreciated both by the students and by us at the faculty, so thank you so much. I would like to talk a little bit about globalization, how increased globalization have an impact on our societies and economies, and in particularly on the labor markets. And as soon as you say increased globalization, some historians will jump and say, well, there's nothing new under the sun. And it's actually true that if you go back to 1870 or so, the world was remarkably globalized. If you looked at trade flows from the old world, was very high. Capital flows from UK and later from Germany and so forth to the new world was amazingly high. And you had, of course, the big migration flows to not only US, but US and South America, Australia, and so forth. But I think one could argue that there is a structural shift, and there has been a remarkable development, perhaps only in the last 2 or 3 decades. And if you look at this time period, you will find that export as a share of GDP for many European countries have exploded. Okay, so they've gone from, a country like Sweden has gone from 30% of GDP to over 50% of GDP in 20 years' time. If you look at multinational firms, it's clear that they have become much more important. So the value of production in foreign affiliates of multinational firms is about 20% higher than the total value of international trade. So multinational firms has really become a key actor in the global economy. And then, of course, we have this new wave of migration that no one can have missed is taking place right here and now, which also, I think, is a sign of globalization. Why do we have this? What is it that has happened and can explain? And yeah, this is maybe the best illustration, I think, of globalization. It's not the total international trade flows of the multinational firms. This is a very, very simple product, a shirt that, all countries can manufacture. And this particular shirt happens to be manufactured in Malaysia. But what's interesting, I think, is that, in this simple shirt, there are so many countries involved. 13, if I remember correctly, yeah. So the cotton from India, seeds are developed in the US, fibers from Portugal, collars from Brazil, machinery from Germany, dyes from 6 countries, and then it's sold in Switzerland. So this very basic product, like a shirt that everyone can manufacture, involves 13 countries. And I think that's actually something that we never have seen in history before, when you have this fragmentization of the production process, where small parts of the production process is carried out in different countries, and they are shipped to one country, it's all put together and then re-exported. And that's something new. And this is a simple product like a shirt, but if you look at more other industries like electronics, for instance, they have extremely sophisticated production chains that spans over many, many different countries. So that's a new aspect of globalization that have impacts on how our societies and economies are working. Why? What is it that explains this, which I argue is a structural change? Well, I think there are 2 main reasons here. One is the view on internationalization, and the other one is the progress in technology and that has taken place. And when we look at the views on trade and multinational firms, globalization, it has changed quite dramatically. It's not so long ago where we as economics professors advocated support of indigenous industries, maybe behind the tariff walls. You should create strong industries under protection that later could compete in the international market, the whole import substitution debate and so forth. If you look at the view on multinational firms, it's even more recent. I think as late as in the 1980s, many, perhaps even most European countries had some type of protection from foreign multinational firms. There were some restrictions on how they could enter the country and in which sectors and if they could acquire domestic firms and so forth. This has totally changed. I think it has become clear that there is no alternative to integration with the international economy, and firms are not using tariffs as a way to protect the domestic industries, at least not to the extent that they used to do. The attitude towards foreign direct investment, multinational firms, the same thing, has gone from being, I said, very protective to a situation where a lot of countries now actually subsidize foreign firms to come into their countries because they believe, rightly or wrongly, that it brings with them new technology and employment and so forth. There are, of course, setbacks. I saw in the outset of the global crisis in 2008 that France under Sarkozy and also China and US and other countries started to at least threaten with protectionist actions, but it did not so much came out of it. But there are times of setbacks, but in the long run, it has definitely become much more liberalized. That has been supported by international organizations. I think GATT and later WTO, was a big success. Managed to bring down tariffs primarily on industrial goods to very low levels globally today. Unfortunately, they have lost steam. It's not a driving force in the globalization today. One of the reasons is that they have now wandered into much more difficult areas. It's one thing to take down tariffs on manufacturing goods. It's much more difficult when you start to talk about service industries, agriculture, patent rights, and the like. It's also the case that they are victim of their own success in the sense that when they have succeeded, more and more countries have joined the WTO. And just to make a comparison, when they made a first round of negotiations many decades ago, it took less than a year, 6 months or something like that, and it was 20 countries involved. Today, the Doha round started in 2001 and still not finalized, but it's 140 countries involved. So it's much more difficult to reach agreements with so many countries. What has happened is when we have got the failure of the WTO, it has been balanced by a lot of bilateral treatments, and you can't have avoided to see all the discussions about the TIPS and TRIPS and so forth, and also by regional free trade areas. I think this is a development that's slightly worrying. It will create a system that's more difficult to navigate for firms and countries, where you have different tariffs depending on which country that's doing the trade, and also in light of what we talked about before, the fragmentation, that you have so many countries involved, it makes it more difficult for firms. It's also worrying in the sense that for small countries, especially small developing countries, they are not of interest to the big ones, so it's easy that they're being left out of these bilateral kind of agreements. But overall, a totally change in attitude towards globalization, towards international trade, towards multinational firms. That has then been accompanied by huge changes and progress in technology and falling transport costs. Okay, so there's a picture here. Might be difficult to see, but this showing the cost. In Swedish, I see. It's a language lesson as well. The fall in transport costs for ocean freight, for air freight, air transport, for transatlantic phone calls, and from satellite usage. Well, the overall story is just that if it costs 100 euros to transport a box in 1920, it costs you roughly $30 today. So huge fall in transport cost, And that is because the container ships, the processing of cargo in the harbors and things like that has become much more efficient. The equally sharp fall in air transport, well, that has to do with things like better airplanes, but also with the deregulation of the air traffic market. And this explains why you have this huge increase in globalization. I lived in Asia for some years, and I was, could never really get used to the idea that I could go to a supermarket in Singapore and I bought Danish butter. I mean, how can you transport a simple product like butter across the world and sell it and compete with the local producers and sell it in Singapore? Well, because transport costs are zero, right? So if you are just a little bit better than the competitors, you can sell your goods all over the world. Or how come that you can buy a bouquet of roses in Zurich for €5, something like that. These are picked in Kenya, they are transported by airplane to Holland, and then on trucks and lorries to Zurich and so forth, and they sell it for €5. Well, because transport costs are so low. So that has really had a dramatic impact on this increase in trade. Okay, the question is then, is it good? And I think it's quite clear in my mind that for the world as total, it has been hugely beneficial, okay? Hugely beneficial. I think sometimes we tend to forget how all the progress that has been made in the world, okay? And I think there was a debate yesterday about this, and I totally agree with the person who stood up and said that, but look, we have made so much progress. I think that's true. If you look at poverty 200 years ago, okay? So 200 years ago, 85% of the world's population lived in deep poverty, okay? If you look at 1990, which feels like yesterday, but which is actually 25 years ago, but still, in 1990, 38% of the world's population lived in deep poverty. And now, last week, the new figures came from the World Bank saying that 10% of the population lives in deep poverty. So it's a tremendous improvements in living standards. And you see this when it comes to access to healthcare, access to clean water, the number of mothers dying while giving birth or things like that. All these indicators, or political freedom, or the number of people dying in military conflicts, all this kind of figures shows, huge improvements. All of this is absolutely not caused by globalization, but I think there are a lot of studies trying to, estimate how much of the economic growth and so forth is caused by globalization. And it's fair to say it's a substantial part. Some studies suggest that of the post-Second World War growth, maybe 20% is due to increased globalization. So that's a substantial part of this increase in living standards. If we look at, that's the whole as a world. If we look for different countries, it's probably no alternative to globalization, but it turns out that some countries find it more difficult than others to participate in this globalization. So if you are a landlocked country, for instance, and I'm not meaning landlocked like Switzerland with good neighbors, but if you are a landlocked Central Asian or Sub-Saharan African countries, it might be more difficult. If you are Uganda and have South Sudan and Congo and so forth as neighbors, it's more difficult for these countries to link into these global production chains and so forth. So there could be a difference there. It's also clear that if you look within countries, the effect is heterogeneous. And there has been a little bit discussion here, I think, about Rostock and so forth, and how different cities are doing. I think what we've seen in Europe for the last 20, 25, 30 years is that or higher concentration of economic activity. That typically mid-sized cities, manufacturing-based cities, are facing more and more difficulties, whereas the big metropolitan area are growing rapidly. And part of this is due to globalization, because what happens when transport costs are falling, when tariffs are abolished, is that firms can concentrate production to one place rather than having them in many different places, okay? So globalization has contributed to this concentration of economic activity within Europe, for instance. So within countries, there are regions who probably are hurt by globalization, although the country as a whole is benefiting. And then finally, how is it with different socioeconomic groups or different income groups? And here it's clear that globalization has different effects on different parts of the population. And I think the basic story is the Heckscher-Lean, the factor price equalization kind of story that, okay, Switzerland is a country which is well endowed with high-skilled people. So when globalization increases, Switzerland will produce more high-skilled goods and export them. That means that the demand for high-skilled goes up, wages for high-skilled people go up. In the same time, they will import more goods that use low-skilled people. That means that wages and demand for low-skilled people will go down. Income inequality increases in the West or in the wealthy countries as a result of globalization. So that's a basic story that we've known for a long time, and that all data shows that that is correct, that globalization has contributed to this increase in income inequality that we see in many countries. But, and I would like to focus a little bit on new research that I'm myself engaged in, that shows that the picture is actually more complex. So that also within the same skill groups, there are different effects. Within the same industries, there are different effects on different people and different firms and so forth. And that has actually also an implication for the labor market outcome. And we will talk a little bit about that now. So the first effect is outsourcing, or sometimes said offshoring, when you put parts of the production process in Bulgaria or Slovakia instead of keeping it in Switzerland, okay? Offshoring. What has happened is that this type of offshoring, the potential for doing that has, of course, exploded with internet. It used to be the case that everything you could pack in a box could be traded, okay? Now everything that could be an attachment to an email can be traded. And that means that a huge new set of tasks can be offshored. And what's interesting for us is that these tasks that can be offshored, that we can put in Slovakia or in India or in Poland, they are only partially correlated with the skill intensity, okay? So there's certainly some low-skill tasks that we can outsource. Call centers, for instance, even Sweden, despite the language, you have firms that are training people in Senegal to be able to speak Swedish, and then they put the call center there because it's cheaper than keeping it in Sweden. But a lot of the other tasks that we can outsource is high-skill tasks, and you have all heard about computer programming in Bangalore in India. But it could also be things like accounting is increasingly carried out in other countries now. So it's only partially correlated with skill level. And for instance, if you look at the health sector, you have the nurse. You cannot outsource what the nurse is doing. She has to sit by the bedside of the patient. But some of the tasks that the doctor is doing, like analysis, X-rays and so forth, is increasingly being outsourced. So within high-skilled groups, you have some types of jobs that are facing a decline in the demand and a negative wage development. And I think this is, what's interesting with this is also for political reasons. I think this is the first time in history that we in Europe see globalization actually hurting parts of the middle class, okay? And if we think that the middle class is rather vocal and so forth, it could have political implications, I think. So offshoring, is kind of one new complex aspect of globalization that has a little bit of different effect than what we traditionally have thought about. This is just to show you, this is not my work, this is by author and some other American researchers, but they show then, what type of task are you doing in US industries from 1960s to 2000. And, what they call manual tasks, things that can be easily outsourced, offshored, that's declining. When you look at routine tasks that you can give codified rules how to do them, and they don't need this kind of tacit knowledge and things like that. That has been offshored. That is disappearing. What remains in the US is, abstract tasks, things that you do that need personal interaction and that you cannot write these kind of codified things for. That's remained. And this is happening all over Europe as well. And I think we are only seeing the beginning of this aspect of globalization. The second kind of aspect that is happening now, which has an impact, is the matching. And this is work that I've been involved in myself. And what we find is that globalization, has even within industries, different firms are affected very differently by globalization. And it's clear that the firms that benefit from globalization are strong firms, are large firms, okay? They are able to reap market shares in other countries, and you can show that both theoretically and empirically. So what happens now is when these big firms, the strong firms, can expand production, they increase the margins, they are better able to recruit the good workers. Okay? So there's a difference in the sorting of workers and firms in our economies because of globalization. When it benefits some of the firms, they can recruit the best workers. And you actually see an improvement in the matching process on the labor market because of globalization. And I have just to show you one example of it. This is from some work I've done on Sweden. And what we've done here is that we have this curve here is foreign tariffs on Swedish exports. And the only thing you have to care about is that it's going down. Okay, that's part, it's showing that openness from the world for Swedish exports is increasing. Globalization is increasing. What we then did was to estimate the quality of all the workers in the Swedish industry. So we have data on all workers in Swedish industry. We can estimate the quality of these workers, and then we can estimate the quality of each firm in Swedish industry. And we correlate the quality of each worker with the quality of the firm where this worker is working. Okay, that sounded complicated, but it's not. So that's a kind of a measure on the matching. High correlation coefficient means that the best workers are working with the best firms. Okay, and what you see, I found this really interesting. Is steady increase in this matching in the Swedish industry between 1995 and 2005. What does this mean? Well, it means for Sweden as a whole it's good. It's a better utilization of resources. That the matching process is improved. But it also means that the wage inequality even within occupations is increasing. The good workers, the payoff for being a good worker is increasing, compared to the wage for being a mediocre worker or perhaps even a bad worker. So income inequality might increase. Okay, we have the outsourcing, the offshoring, we have the change in the matching process, and then we have occupational structure of the firms. And it's not easy to be a firm and internationalize. It's not easy to go from producing only for Switzerland and then suddenly start to produce also for Germany. We all hear a lot of stories about born global firms and so forth. But in reality, these firms are very, very unusual. I mean, the typical pattern is that you set up a shop in Engelberg, and after a year or two, you put up a second shop in Zurich, and then you expand in Switzerland. And after a while, you might expand, and typically you do that, to Germany or Austria, one of the neighboring countries where you know the culture and the language and so forth. And it's a huge step from going to be producing only for the domestic market to producing also for the international market. You have to invest in learning about logistics, about foreign preferences, about foreign regulations, marketing, things like that, And because you have to make all of these investments to be internationalized, you need to recruit people that know about these things. You need to have people that know about the international law, about logistics, and about marketing in foreign countries and so forth. So what you get is that the occupational structure. So even within one industry or firm that is producing for the local market has a different distribution of occupations compared to firms that produce for export, which has a different distribution for firms that are multinational firms. Okay, And this distribution turns out that the more globalized a firm is, the more skilled occupation they have in the workforce. And I have a study on that together with some American colleagues, where we look again on the Swedish industry. And let me just explain basically what this is. So we have 100 occupations in our data. This is the least skilled occupation. This is the most skilled occupations. And here we have the cumulative distribution of these occupations. So it's, of course, it ends at 1. That's all occupations. We have 3 different sorts of firms. Local firms only producing for Sweden. We have exporters, and we have multinational firms. So we see that, that for instance, if you take the 50% of the low-skilled occupation, that employs roughly, 2/3 of the labor force in the local firms, roughly 50% of the labor force in the exporters, and roughly 40% of the labor force in the multinational firms. So there's a clear difference in what type of occupations you have in the firm, depending on how internationalized you are. Why is this important? Well, I think it's important because if we think that, the trade cost is going down further, or let's assume the trade cost is falling further, transport cost is falling further, that means that more firms are becoming globalized. It means that the demand for some occupations are going to increase more than for other occupations. So they will have, again, an impact on things like wage dispersion and inequality and so forth. Yeah, and there's a session on inequality later today, and I'm not going to tell too much, but maybe this is one way to look at it. If we take wage inequality in the whole Swedish industry, you can divide it between wage inequality within firms, that the CEO makes much more than the cleaner, and then you can have another component, which is inequality between firms. The between firms is this, and we see that it has gone up of the total inequality. The between firm inequality has gone from 26% to 35%. Within this between firm inequality, you could have part of the inequalities because firm A pays more for a given occupation than firm B. Okay, this is this part. And then you can have because some firms have more high wage occupations than others, and this is what's the most important component, and which has increased from 15% to maybe 19%. So wage inequality caused by these changes in occupational structure seems to be important. Globalization increases inequality. The most important, driving force is this, the hectare lean. Okay, low skill loses out. But I tried and very kind of in a shallow way, but briefly say that there's also all these other mechanisms going around within industries and within similar income groups. Inequality is increasing. Is it a problem? Well, I think it's a political issue, and I think it has to be put into perspective of the context. And I would believe that what's perceived as an acceptable inequality in US would differ from what's acceptable in Switzerland, which would differ from what's acceptable in Sweden. It depends on context and history and so forth. I think that what the economic literature tells us is this, that it's not good to have too small inequalities, and it's not good to have too big inequalities. That's my reading of the literature. Why is it not good with too small? Well, if you don't have any inequality at all, you take away the incentives for work and education and so forth, right? That's Sweden in 1980, okay? It's probably been the non-state planned economy with the lowest income inequality in world history. Okay, so in 1980, very small inequality, but it was a totally dysfunctional country, of course. And there was no real wage growth from 1970 to 1990. Wages didn't go up at all. Okay, so that's not good. We don't want Sweden in 1980, but we don't want too high and too big inequalities either, because what happens then, it seems that it ruins the kind of social cohesion, and it could easily lead to political turmoil and so forth. And these are important, very important aspects, things like social capital, trust, and things like that, really key aspects of development. So kind of mid inequality is best, whatever that is. Again, I think it has a little bit to do with the context, with the country in question. Let me now, in the last 3 minutes, just say a little thing about what are the labour market policies, the consequences. And of course, always easier to show what's going on than to say what we should do. But these are my thoughts, and I'm happy to hear your reactions on this. And first of all, I mean, we have to realize that the volatility increases because of globalization. You have a burst of a housing bubble in the US, and the whole world goes bananas. And when the more you export, the more your volatility increases, and so forth, right? So it's clear that the stability, the Japanese type of lifelong employment, I think that era is gone. Most people probably will have to change job in their career. And we have to make it possible for these people to change jobs. I think education, we talked about education yesterday, and I think education is wonderful and important for people to fulfill themselves and to be able to do something good about their life. But I think the traditional way in a country like Sweden to approach the issue of increased competition from globalization has been to provide higher and higher education. That is not sufficient anymore. And then the reason is that, as I said before, we can see that even within high-skilled groups, there are winners and losers and so forth. It actually turns out, so what we do in Sweden, and maybe the same here, is that we say now it's very important to have gymnasium, high school, I guess, in English. Okay, so everyone should have gymnasium and so forth. But guess what? These people are actually the most vulnerable ones. So I have one figure on that here. So these are a study, not by myself, but by Goose and Quarters, looking at the divide jobs into low-skilled, medium-skilled, and upper-skilled jobs in US and European Union average, and then in a lot of European countries. Okay, the message, what is that? Well, it's that high-skilled people, they're doing well. Those jobs are increasing, okay. Low-skilled people are actually doing quite well as well. And that's maybe part of this offshoring. It's very difficult to offshore a lot of these jobs in service sector that need to have personal interactions. But the big losers are actually the medium-educated people here. Those jobs are disappearing. So education, wonderful, but might not be enough to address the problems. I think what we need to have is some sort of the Danish system where you have, a flexible labor market, but also providing a social safety net, that you enable, that it's okay that people are being laid off and re-employed, but you also enable these people to survive in between jobs. And, a flexible labor market is, of course, making it easier to hire and fire people. That's the hard truth of it. It also means that we need to have lower thresholds for coming into labor market. And this is, increasingly important in view of the recent migration flows. I mean, Germany now talking about 1 million refugees, maybe more. Sweden, 150,000 only this year, in a country of 9 million people. We know that, I don't know, it's a heterogeneous group, but I think figures suggest that maybe 50% of these people have at most 9 years of education, and the quality of these 9 years might not be so impressive. So, of course, we have to think about such things as lower minimum wages, okay? And these are really political, very difficult decisions. But I think if you have an open migration policy, you probably have to accept, wider income gaps. And I think politically that's difficult. The ones, at least in Sweden, that are most in favor of immigration are also the ones that hate income inequality the most. But you can't have both. We need to have good labor market institutions. I think if you look at the European experience with public labor market institutions helping laid off people to get new jobs, it's mixed success rate at the most. A lot of these public institutions are perhaps not delivering as well as we hope. I know in Australia they have trying now with private institutions that get paid by the public if they are able to get jobs for unemployed people. I don't know enough about that example, but it might be worthwhile to look into. And then we need a social safety net. If we want to have acceptance for globalization, I think it's important that people can survive between jobs. And this is, I think, it's no coincidence that if you look at small open economies, countries where trade and so forth are very important, they tend to have a bigger welfare state than large economies where globalization is not so important. There are exceptions, but overall that's the case in the world. So we need to have some kind of social safety net, according to me. The problem is that it's becoming more and more difficult to finance, partly because of globalization. We know that corporate taxes are coming down all over Europe. We know that multinational firms that are key actors, as I said, they don't pay any corporate tax whatsoever. Sweden abolished wealth tax and inheritance tax 9 years ago. Why? Well, because the founder of IKEA, Ingvar Kamprad, one of the richest men in the world, he lives in Lausanne. The founder of Tetra Pak, one of the richest men in the world, Rausing, he lives in London, and so forth. I mean, in a globalized world, it's very difficult to tax this kind of income sources. So let me finish here by saying that we need a social safety net, but it's some tough political decisions to have to be made here, and saying what we should cut down instead. Thank you.
Thank you, Fredrik. Thank you very much. We open the floor for discussions, and I would ask you to maybe stand up for your question, please. 1, 2.
Hi, I'm Vincent from Bern, and I have quite some acquaintances working in the outsourcing advisory business. And my question is about automation, because this is kind of the next leap forward, right? There's already companies who are temporizing the offshoring or the outsourcing because they think that within 5 years they won't need to go to a center in India, Poland, Romania, wherever to get what they need, but they'll be able to have robots or softwares, algorithms doing this for them. And of course, this raises a whole new set of questions about how to keep people busy and what for them to do. But do you have any thoughts on that? Because I think this is kind of the logical next steps in your research.
Yeah, that's it's a very interesting question. It's a very difficult question. But what we can say so far is that, yes, automatization is really technology progress. Okay, you have new machinery or you have computers or whatever. That has been extremely important in leading to this widening of the income gaps, of the inequalities. Perhaps more important than globalization, actually, that we suddenly got computers that could replace a lot of the secretaries, or we got more machines in the factories that could replace the workers. That has really explained our income inequality. Is it like that this will continue? Yes. Will it mean that offshoring is going to stop? I don't think so, but I can't really substantiate that. But I think we only see the beginning of this offshoring. That firms are especially in non-English speaking countries, that we are just now starting to realize the potential of it. And I don't see it's ending, but it's speculation. I can't substantiate that. What was the third one? There was something more that I lost. Well, I only answer the questions that make me look good, so maybe I drop that one.
Okay, we'll move on, please.
Fredrik, I also want to add an aspect of outsourcing.
Yeah.
I propose a smart differentiation. You offered us certain typologies, abstract routine work, manual work, and other types of occupation. I add another one that is human-related tasks.
Yeah.
2 examples, human resource management and marketing. If you go abroad, you have to look at the labor law, you mentioned it, at the customs, at the culture. Yeah. You have to look at how advertising is really working, which taboos is it violating or not. So here you can have the strategy, the concept at the headquarters, but you must implement the task in the local area. So that is a smart differentiation in outsourcing. Some elements are kept within the headquarter, strategy, concept, and others, implementation, because culture matters, law matters, must be done at the front. So this could perhaps help the outsourcing idea to be more smart and differentiated.
Yeah, no, thanks for your comment. It's very well taken, and you're of course an expert in this field with your experience of doing research and teaching in this. But it's absolutely true that one should not underestimate the importance of these differences in cultures, and there are ample of evidence how firms have failed because they have underestimated it. In the same time, our firms, at least the big multinational firms, are becoming better and better at this. And I think if you look at the big Swiss firms, they are almost not Swiss anymore. I mean, they have been out there now for decades and in so many countries, so whether they are engaged in Singapore or in Switzerland, it's not a big deal for them. But you're absolutely true that has an implication for the whole analysis. But the trend is the same.
Fredrik, hi. Thank you. It was very interesting. Let me tell you the following. I just learned a couple of hours ago that in Sweden, from now on, or it's going to come, that instead to work 8 hours, it's going to be 6 hours. Correct?
No.
So that the information was wrong.
The information was wrong.
And also, they get a good example of Toyota in Sweden, where they are using these 6 hours for years and years, and all the people working there are very happy.
Yeah, no, I think that's wrong. I think the Green Party has often proposed that we should get down and work 6 hours a day, and they are part of the government. But I don't see that's happening. I think the discussion is really that we need to work longer hours. I think the only country that have done such a dramatic reduction in working hours was France, I think in 1980s, right? And that was, they don't have any good experience of that, if I say that, at least.
Right. Yeah.
Ernst Hafen, ETH Zurich. I'm interested in following up on the question of job elimination and sort of the globalization. You've talked mostly about firms and national economies, etc. But I think jobs will be eliminated that can be automated, but human collaboration across borders will be much more important. And Luciano Floridi in the Fourth Revolution calls this the multi-agent bodies that are no longer in countries or in companies. Examples are Wikipedia. Examples are Duolingo, where people collaborate on translating text, etc. So I think citizen science, the White House just had 5 different events this year on citizen science as sort of multi-agent collaborations. These are often not for profit or not in the economy. You have Uber and these first sort of movers that are the winner takes it all mentality. But how do you see this sort of multi-agent body collaborations affect world economy and globalization?
It's a very difficult question. I think very interesting, very difficult. But I think you're absolutely right. There's so much happening here in different layers of our society and so forth. What you're saying, if I interpret you right, is that okay, we talk about countries and so forth, but maybe that's not the correct unit to analyze. Maybe we should look at regions spanning several countries and so forth. Is that And I think that is true, but in the same time, I must say that I'm sometimes surprised how important the nation state still is, and how, despite, give an example. I live in Lund. Okay, I grew up in Malmö, a blue-collar town just across the bridge from Copenhagen, and the other Swedes, they call us half Danes and so forth. And we have this bridge now. I go to Copenhagen in 40 minutes time. But still, there are some type of barriers there, and the integration is much less than what you would have expected. My only conclusion is that it's definitely too soon to say goodbye to the nation state, and the trend is probably towards regions becoming more important and so forth, but it probably takes some time before we reach that.
Right, thank you, and last question.
Thank you, Fredrik. Gerd Volkers, Kollegium Helveticum. Your statistics on showing that the medium-level educated people are in danger, or most in danger, confused me a little bit, because the notion of medium-level education is a strongly relative one. So it's a very dynamic notion. It's a question of continuing education, or having the possibility of continuing education. I have 2 concrete examples. The first one is United Parcel Service, a logistics center in North Carolina. people have new software, new computers, so the people that want to keep their job have to undergo a de-skilling seminar to lose their skills, not to interfere with the computer. The second example is what I learned last week from NZZ, from the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, is that an algorithm has been elected in the board of directors of a Hong Kong consulting company. So now this is a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean there are these different. I think I started by saying that, you know, working in the education business myself, I do think it's important for a lot of different reasons, and it's also probably yeah. If you have some education, you're probably easier for you to move to other jobs and so forth. But I do think that yeah, this is how it looks, and I do think that it has something to do with the offshoring. That the occupation that requires the least education are typically not traded occupations, so to speak, right? So they have been kind of safe in a sense that they need to be carried out in Engelberg or in, you know, and so forth, right? So yeah, what can I say? It's just like this is how the figure looks like. So.
Right. Thank you, Fredrik. Thank you very much for coming over.